Political leaders, various experts, and even a few know-nothings like me have been heard to say in recent weeks and months that we have reached the point where we need to learn to live with COVID. In principle, that's obviously true. But what does that phrase actually mean? Is it one of these phrases that we can all use without noticing? For some people, the same words are interpreted in very different ways. As one commentator noted, for some, the phrase living with COVID has become shorthand for let's not do anything else. Now, I wouldn't have phrased it exactly like that, but that's closer to what I'd rather been imagining. But then others have said that in their view, learning to live with COVID means wearing masks in indoor situations in perpetuity. Well, there's quite a gap between those two. So what's the reality behind what we can expect about how this is going to settle down? What can we learn about what's happened in similar cases in the past? And what should it mean to learn to live with COVID? Well, let's have a look. The central principle behind the end of the disruption from COVID is that it becomes an endemic disease, no longer a pandemic. Some people had hoped it would be eliminated totally, zero COVID, but that has clearly become a fantasy at this point. So what does it mean for COVID to move from being pandemic to being endemic? A pandemic, of course, is an epidemic that is taking place on multiple continents and doing so in significant waves of infection that are unpredictable and out of the ordinary. It's rather hard to look at the worldwide graph of COVID cases and conclude that we've moved beyond the pandemic phase across the globe just yet. So in strict terms, the pandemic doesn't end until the WHO declares it over, just as it declared it a pandemic on the 11th of March 2020. That end will come when new infections occur at pretty constant rates, not those big unpredictable waves. That will be when it's moved from pandemic to endemic. But naturally, that will happen in some countries before others. In the UK, we are increasingly optimistic that it's within sight. The commonly used comparison is that COVID will become as widespread and severe as the flu, which causes annual mini-epidemics in many countries, but within certain bounds, and at predictable times of the year usually, and at risk to a predictable cohort of people. So living with a flu has been that every year you create a vaccine that you hope is relatively targeted to what's emerging as the dominant strain. You vaccinate the vulnerable, the elderly generally, and everyone else gets on with life without much thinking about it. Nobody records daily death counts. Nobody obsesses about whether they might be a vector for transmission for it. They just get on with it. And if young, healthy people get the flu, well, that sucks, but it's over in a few days. Some have argued that that's the last thing we want, for COVID-19 to become like the flu. Christina Pagel of University College says that such an outcome would be a disaster for the UK. Why? Because, she says, flu already strains the country's national health services in winter. If you added COVID to that, there would be a significant increase in caseload that would push the system over the edge. Now, I find that curious. While noting, let me give my traditional disclaimer, I am not an expert in this area, never ever take medical advice from YouTubers, etc, etc. But I find it a curious proposition because surely flu and COVID-19 principally target the same vulnerable groups. So while COVID might turn out to be more efficient in finding and targeting them, you wouldn't expect the impact to be additive in the way that you would if they targeted different groups. And arguably we've seen that, haven't we? The rates of flu deaths have been right down over the last couple of years. One presumes that's at least partly because the vulnerable people that flu would have taken were the ones sadly taken instead by COVID. Generally, I try to take the line that if I don't understand something that is stated by scientists, then that's probably because they know something that I don't, and I just try to find out what that is. However, that's sort of the world of peer-reviewed research and large amounts of agreement between the experts. But in the world of celebrity scientist opinions on COVID, rather than those peer-reviewed studies, there is a universe, apparently, of qualified experts with sharply contrasting views. So at some point, we just have to try to make sense of it based on the logic behind the arguments presented. What we can do is look at studies of diseases that might bear some similarities to COVID in important ways. So, for instance, let's take the endemic coronavirus OC43. You may not have heard of it. It's one of a number of viruses that causes the common cold. Studies have shown that once you've had OC43, it would typically be between 3 to 6 years before you might expect to get reinfected by it. That well-transmissible coronavirus generates an estimated 45,000 daily infections in the UK, when society is functioning normally, of course. Rustam Ansher of Emory University noted what this meant for that fond hope of some for zero COVID, achieved when we reach herd immunity. For respiratory infections, we don't get lifelong immunity that prevents us getting infected. If it behaves like other coronaviruses, we will need to forget about herd immunity. I think it will be with us forever in the population, most likely, and I think we will need annual vaccines. Although that depends on severity. In the 1980s, there was a small study that deliberately infected volunteers with the human coronavirus 229E, another common cold virus. Out of 15, 10 became infected, 8 of whom had symptoms. The following year, they re-exposed them again. 6 of the 10 previously infected were reinfected, but the second time, none of them developed symptoms. From that, you have to emphasise again, small study, they concluded that immunity against coronavirus infection wanes quickly and reinfections are common, but those subsequent infections are milder or asymptomatic. No guarantees that applies to SARS-CoV-2, but encouraging nonetheless. An article in Nature last year looks at comparisons with flu. So when it comes to flu, the 1918 pandemic, which killed more than 50 million people, is the comparator against which all other pandemics tend to get measured. It came from a variety of bird flu, and all subsequent flu pandemics since then have come from descendants of that 1918 virus. By the time a pandemic virus becomes seasonal, much of the population has some immunity to it. But the flu virus changes quickly, and so pandemics occur when populations are sufficiently new to the current strain. So seasonal flu still has a significant toll globally, killing around 650,000 people in an average year. But in that article, it was observed that flu seems to evolve much faster than SARS-CoV-2, which makes it better at sneaking past previously immune defences, which is why it needs an annual vaccine. At that point, it was said, if SARS-CoV-2 doesn't change so much, then the annual dose might not be needed so much. Well, since that article, we've seen the wave of the Delta variant and now the Omicron variant, so it might seem a ridiculous speculation on its face. We'll look at why that's been happening a little bit later, because it's really quite interesting. In the meantime, we still want to know when this is going to become endemic, and we are hoping it's soon. On the 10th of January this year, Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez said that European officials should reclassify Covid-19 as an endemic illness due to falling death rates from Omicron. The next day, Marco Cavalieri at the European Medicines Agency agreed. What we're seeing is that we are moving toward the virus being more endemic. And of course, the UK's Nadam Zahawi said that we were witnessing the transition of the virus from pandemic to endemic. But the WHO pushed back on all this. At its press conference on the 11th of January, it said that such a transition is still a long way off. Catherine Smallwood of WHO Europe said endemicity assumes that there's stable circulation of the virus at predictable levels with predictable waves of transmission that doesn't rely on external forces being placed in order to maintain that stability. In other words, if you just came out of a lockdown to any degree, you can't look at the current numbers and judge them to mean that the disease is endemic. Lawrence Young from the University of Warwick said this, I don't think we're actually anywhere near endemic. I think a lot of it is wishful thinking. He said that we may only be able to say when the COVID became endemic by looking backwards. Often you don't know when the transition's occurring, only in retrospect. Part of the problem, though, is that even if we can agree when it's happened, we don't necessarily agree on what that means. The term endemic has no specific definition, so our exciting polarised society has immediately led to various strongly held and incompatible opinions on the topic. On the safetyism side of the spectrum, Claire Wilson wrote this in New Scientist magazine. The virus becoming endemic wouldn't necessarily mean that it is safe to stop measures such as mask wearing. She pointed out that in some countries endemic diseases are pretty deadly and loom large on the list of things that we'd really rather quite like to do something about. Malaria is endemic in a number of countries, with cases rising in the rainy season. Well, of course, malaria kills hundreds of thousands of people, especially children. Learning to live with it has meant local populations taking significant safety measures. Dr. Helen Salisbury, a senior GP and Oxford academic, reinforced this point, saying that people may regret talking about COVID becoming endemic as a good thing. And she said this: TB and smallpox were once endemic in the UK. It doesn't mean mild, it just means widespread. Francois Balloux, professor at computational biology at University College London, reflected that epidemiologists should have come up with a tighter definition of endemic. The common definition, which is regularly found in a particular area, is, he said, misleading. For epidemiologists, de facto, it's really more of a technical definition around the virus's reproduction value, setting it around 1. So one person who caught it would then, on average, pass it on to just one other person. And he said this: essentially it means that things are kept in check up to a point by the immunity in the population. There is a stability and a predictability to an endemic pathogen, but the complication is that they can still go up and down. That said, Professor Balloux is optimistic about SARS-CoV-2 because of the effectiveness of the vaccines principally. He noted this: with every new wave, the virus is left with less space to surprise. Other experts continue to make comments that seem on the face of it quite baffling. So Dr. Susan Hopkins, the UK Health Security Agency Chief Medical Advisor, noted that the number of infections had flattened most recently, having previously been falling, and that seemed to be the basis of her speculating that we might need to create a new word. If SARS-CoV-2 became endemic at the current infection rate, you would need to coin the term hyperendemic, meaning persistent high levels of disease occurrence. Well, if I'm choosing between conflicting expert opinions as to which to give more credence to, I'm probably going to go with the ones that aren't so far removed from historical experience that they need to create a new word to describe it. But then again, maybe that's just my wishful thinking again. Dr. Monica Gandhi announced in the Wall Street Journal that COVID was on the verge of becoming endemic back in September. An expert opinion I would probably have embraced at the time, but it turned out to be quickly dated by the arrival of Delta and, of course, latterly Omicron. Mainly the former added another 145,000 deaths to the US count, for all the fuzzy grey areas of how those things get counted. Dr. Adam Kucharski, epidemiologist at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, said that the pattern of SARS-CoV-2's evolution is unpredictable and very different from flu. How so? With seasonal flu variants, the new ones replace parent lineages, meaning that you get a narrow family tree, or what he described as a lopsided ladder. Each variant is an evolution of and a replacement for what came before. So here's one example: Fluenza A H3N2, where you can see the lopsided ladder pattern of development. And to take a human coronavirus, 229E, you see broadly the same pattern. And again, the 2009 pandemic influenza A H1N1P, it branched early but quickly settled into the same pattern of what's called antigenic turnover. But so far, SARS-CoV-2 is more varied, a wider tree, or a balanced tree. And you can see the effect of this in that Omicron didn't come from the Delta lineage, and Delta wasn't a descendant of Alpha. Hence, Omicron could go so significantly differently to Delta to be less affected by vaccines that worked well on previous variants, even evading components of testing. That's because these new variants have been appearing suddenly with large numbers of mutations already in place, a lot more than you would ever see with a more linear incremental tree. And he tweeted this: "Regardless of exact origins, this pattern means we shouldn't assume next variant of interest/concern will emerge from current circulating Omicron viruses. Like other variants, it may well have already evolved or be evolving somewhere from a much older ancestor lineage." He did go on to say that we shouldn't assume it doesn't ultimately go on to fit the old model. I think seasonal coronaviruses and influenza are a sensible prior to bear in mind for what long-term dynamics of antigenic turnover of SARS-CoV-2 could look like. But we also need to remember this process of sequential turnover isn't what happened so far. Interestingly, the unprecedented global shutdowns, particularly of international travel, could be responsible, or at least influential, on those differences. Reduction in global travel may also have influenced variant dynamics globally so far, and subsequent reopening may change this, as there is less potential for evolutionary villages that are relatively cut off from global dynamics. Which makes sense. I mean, the more mixed together things are, the less opportunity to have completely different evolutionary pathways. It's an impossible question to answer because we don't know. It's easy to speculate that stopping international travel ended up causing more harm than good for that reason. Rather than 1 or 2 waves that we would have had, we ended up with 4 or 5, or God help us, 6. We don't get to do split testing on reality, where we try out different scenarios and see what happens, so nobody should state such things with certainty. For all we know, SARS-CoV-2 behaves differently because, it came from a laboratory and didn't undergo a standard evolutionary path. Who knows? The unfortunate thing is that when you see solid scientific information explaining why COVID's behaving in uncertain ways, you realise how much damage the propaganda approach of various governments and their agencies have done in all this. The fact that the issues have been politicised, that agencies have promoted messages clearly with a view to provoking the desired compliance in the population, it's left a good many people with good reason to feel deeply suspicious about whatever information they're being given by the authorities. The truth is that we'd better hope that COVID is about to behave itself and become endemic in its milder form, because I don't think populations in many countries will put up with any more government interference in their lives. In the UK, government has been incompetent, inconsistent, and as we now discover, hypocritical on a routine basis. And they're still doing it, announcing that just in the last day, once again, right at the last minute, they probably won't require NHS staff to be vaccinated because they've just realised what has been stated over and over by everyone else for months, that the loss of those staff would devastate the service. When governments are run by people who seem oblivious to the consequences of their actions and are consistently giving unreliable or incomplete information, that has to be factored in as a limiter on the likelihood of population acceptance. Consulting firm McKinsey produced a report on how things might go from here in October last year, titled Pandemic to Endemic: How the World Can Learn to Live with Covid-19. It noted that the shift from pandemic to endemic meant a psychological shift as much as anything else, since a lot of people would have to give up their hope of a clean endpoint. Instead, we would have to learn to endure the ongoing cost in terms of lives lost, and it used this analogy. Around 38,000 Americans die every year in road traffic accidents. As a society, we have developed tools to make road travel safer: seatbelts, airbags, impaired driving laws, and so on. Each road death is a tragedy, and car makers, public safety agencies, and many others continually strive to reduce fatalities. But most of us don't spend much time thinking about road safety. We get in the car, buckle up and go. It said we have to do 4 things to get to this point. 1, we have to come to a consensus on what's an acceptable disease burden and use targets to define that acceptable new normal. 2, we will want to track progress against that standard. 3, define new disease management approaches to limit deaths. And 4, establish practices to slow transmission. And particularly, McKinsey said we had to start taking a whole of society approach. Yes, you have your targets for the health burden of a disease, but you have to start factoring the other costs as well: economic and social disruption. Our response to Covid-19 has had impacts in terms of learning and working, mental health, so many different things. You have to start measuring work days lost, business closures, school absenteeism rates, and so on. In other words, you have to make the other side of a balance sheet visible, not just the direct health impacts of Covid-19 in isolation. Goals must also be realistic, or many sectors of society will quickly lose interest. And leaders must not set goals in a way that requires the most vulnerable in society to bear a disproportionate burden, for example by requiring low-wage frontline workers to communicate or enforce policies. Indeed, one might add, by sacking them if they refuse to take medications that you would wish them to. McKinsey then indulge in fantasy thinking as far as I'm concerned. It shouldn't be the case, but, well, see what you think. Third, leaders must build the widest possible consensus around the goals through effective communication, emphasising the whole of society nature of the targets. Much of the political discord created by Covid-19 over the past 18 months has arisen from differences of opinion about the relative importance of health, economic goals and social goals. Not everyone will agree with every target, but part of managing endemic Covid-19 requires forging a social contract that recognises the need to control the health impact of the disease while normalising society to the greatest extent possible. Some would argue the horse has left the stable on the topic of effective communication by leaders. But, at the same time, I can't help but wonder if McKinsey isn't overthinking it. Of course, there are things that governments and agencies should now be doing, things that citizens don't really need to know that much about. Disease surveillance, for instance, tracking hospitalisations and deaths and trends in milder impacts, ongoing genomic sequencing to monitor for new variants, coordination with vaccine manufacturers so annual doses or whatever it turns out to be for the most vulnerable are calibrated to the current active strains, and some investment in the delivery infrastructures to be well prepared to operate at scale should there be a future pandemic from whichever cause, strike as it will probably at some point. And reviewing all the data from across the world to learn the lessons of which interventions worked, which mostly do not, rather a lot in that last category I suspect, and what were the costs and the consequences of each of them. And looking properly at health system resilience in the face of seasonal strain. Stop just mindlessly throwing money at services that are inefficient, instead work out how you're going to solve the problems. Maybe asking a lot, that last one, I suppose. But let's at least learn the lessons so we don't end up thrashing around mindlessly again next time. Now, the population may take an interest in any of that as citizens, but they don't need to, because it's background stuff. Except for vulnerable populations who should be supported and informed properly. McKinsey concludes, however, with a view that the new normal will be quite different for populations widely. They say this: in this new normal, we can expect 4 approaches to become a regular part of daily life. Ubiquitous testing, safe interactions in workplaces, schools and recreation and entertainment locales, and rapid response to transmission hotspots. Maybe. I don't believe any of those are going to stick. Except maybe the last one, but that would only be when something had been detected that something unusual was going on. However, others have jumped on the same message. So Christina Pagel and Aris Katsourakis, for instance, who called on the 3rd of January for a so-called Vaccines Plus global plan. As well as vaccinating the world, they called for measures such as high-quality face masks for indoor mixing, effective means of testing, tracing, isolating and supporting people who get infected, and better ventilation and filtration of indoor air. Pagel said this: there's no individual liberty taken away that way, and it works against all kinds of airborne diseases. Katsourakis added, without something like a global Vaccines Plus plan, we're going to be in a race of chasing after variants for years to come. They may make that argument. So far, no government seems much attracted to that vision. So we don't have to debate the principle of whether forcing everyone to wear masks indoors in perpetuity or not is taking away individual liberty, because I expect there would be some strong disagreement with Pagel's views on that matter. If we did go there, then it would represent another step towards the safetyism society that I've talked about recently, with all the potential negative consequences that implies. But that's not the only vision. Alternatively, Time magazine recently made 4 predictions for how we would learn to live with COVID. 1, the disease burden will continue to decrease, simply because there are more and more people resistant to the virus, which is compatible with that evidence we talked about earlier. 2, the focus will shift towards protecting the most vulnerable. 3, although political polarisation will continue, that seems like a safe prediction, nevertheless, actual societal risk behaviour will begin to converge and normalise, simply that through the thousands of daily interactions we will indirectly influence each other as public life continues to get back to some semblance of normal. Basically, and these are my words now, once we stop defining our identity by how we respond to the pandemic, we will gradually just do what seems to be common sense without noticing the differences between groups starting to reduce. Don't worry, we'll still be fighting like cats in a bag over everything else. And 4, we will develop the recognition that living with the virus means living with cases and infection, which is what some of us have been saying for quite a while now. But it just means that people will gradually stop accusing us of being reckless and cold-hearted and all those other things. Well, look, this is my take. The disease becoming endemic is one thing. The new normal requires learning from our mistakes and noting how little awareness politicians have had of the consequences of their actions over the last 2 years. We do not benefit from 0 deaths and economic ruin. Indeed, the latter makes the former impossible anyway. It's still going to be a while before everyone's ready to have that discussion, but have it we must. By the way, I mentioned just now about the toll that growing levels of safetyism is having on our society. I made a video about that recently. If you've made it this far, you might want to watch that one next.